Welcome to Camera Shake Podcast, episode 110, the podcast where we talk about photography, videography, and anything that's got anything to do with any of that. And when I say we, this week, it's only me, because Nick is away on business for this week. So unfortunately, there's no way that we can be together, but we thought we'd try something different. Today is a bit of a kind of a solo flight, if you want to call it that. But we thought, there were so many interesting things to talk about that we thought, why not just do a solo episode this time, and then we're back in the room together from next week. So that's basically episode 110. It's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit shorter, short and sweet. That's how we want to do it. Now, there's lots of things lots of things have happened this week. It's been a really busy week, a lot of headshots and lots of other things that have come to fruition. But I was asked a really interesting question by one of my friends earlier this week, and the question was: should hobby photographers charge money for their photography? And I know different people probably have different opinions when it comes to that, but let me talk about it now. Let's talk about it, and let's see if there's an answer to that. So should hobby photographers charge for their photography? Now, I have, of course, a personal opinion about this, and I'm just going to dive right into that because, well, I think they probably should, and there are a number of really good reasons for that. Now, why should they charge? Well, guess what? Photography actually costs money. Anybody who's gotten into photography, either whether that's as an amateur, whether it's as a hobby or professionally, knows that photography isn't cheap. There are lenses to buy, there are camera bodies to buy, there are tripods to buy, there are all sorts of different paraphernalia that we need. From SD cards or memory cards in general, to all sorts of different SD card readers, to backdrop stands, to lighting stands, to lights, to grip, and clamps and everything else. So all of that stuff costs money, and it isn't cheap. And of course, the thing that nobody talks about usually when it comes to that sort of thing is your time and your skill and all the effort that you've put into your skill and your craft over potentially years and years and years. All of that has value. And so in a sense, it's only fair that somebody, recompenses you for that. But do we always have to charge, or should we always charge money, or may there be situations where we might want to do it for free? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, so my first point is really you have a monetizable skill. So it's really a skill that's very specific. I mean, although in this day and age of, iPhone photography, probably everybody thinks they're a photographer to a degree, but actually it's much more of a specialist skill than your regular person assumes maybe. There's a difference between a snapshot and a photograph. We've talked about this many times before. Knowing how to light somebody, a person, if it's a portrait shoot, or knowing how and when to take really awesome street photography, or how to shoot, buildings and properties and all the rest of it. If you want to get really good at that, you need to invest a lot of time into that. And when you're doing work for other people, then, it's a monetizable skill. Absolutely. I've already mentioned it. Gear is expensive. That's my second point. We all know this. I'm sorry to talk about it. Everything's bloody expensive. But, just talk about gear for a minute. Do you, as a professional photographer, do you have the latest and greatest gear? Well, no, you really don't. In fact, I know a lot of professional photographers, meaning photographers who make a living of photography, or it may just be a part-time hustle. Sometimes it's a hassle, but when I say it's a part-time hustle, if it's a part-time hustle, still you still have to invest the same amount of money into it. It doesn't really make much of a difference. I know a lot of professional photographers who don't shoot with the latest and greatest gear. They don't shoot with the latest camera body. May not even have moved on to mirrorless cameras, believe it or not. So in order to create good photography, it's really not necessarily about the gear, although some people may disagree. But, if you just think about it, 20 years ago, there were people who could create awesome photography, no doubt. And 20 years ago, gear wasn't anywhere as good and advanced as it is today. So it was still possible. Yeah. So what does that say to you? It means it does ultimately come down to the skill set of the photographer. Now, the other thing, and this is really very similar to what my experience has been in the music business, years ago, is that others make money from your photography when they use your photos. So it might be, for instance, that you do a band shoot for a band that and of course that band will then go and they will promote themselves with your photography, on posters or flyers or on their website or social media or whatever, and they will promote themselves in order to land gigs that they potentially get paid for. So along the line, somebody else is making money, and if the band plays in the venue, then the venue makes money, and the promoter makes money, and the people that work behind the bar at the venue make money, and everybody makes money except for you if you're the one who's given their work away for free. And that doesn't really seem very fair. And in music, it's always been the same. It's the band's always the last one in the food chain. If you're the musician or if you're the band, everybody gets paid before you, and somehow you're the one who's providing the entertainment. Again, doesn't seem particularly fair, but it's just the world we live in. Anyhow, so other people make money from your photos, so why shouldn't you? That's really the question. Even if you do, if you're doing a headshot for a friend, for example, or for somebody, but not necessarily for a friend, but for anybody, and they then go and get a better job, and they get paid for that, then somebody else has been benefiting from your work and you haven't. So I think it's only fair that you charge something. We're going to talk about how much to charge potentially, in a minute, but let's just establish the fact that it's probably a good idea to get paid. So, and another point is that you spend a lot of time prepping, shooting, and then editing. So that's your time. You're prepping a shoot. Maybe you have to go and suss out the location, for example. You have to travel there potentially. Have a look around. Find a location, do some research, and all that's time. You might have to prep some gear. You may even have to go and borrow some additional gear if you haven't got everything that you need, or God forbid, even hire stuff, which again costs you money. And so then there's the actual shoot, and again, all of that is time, and you're using skills that you've developed over a long time potentially. And yeah, it just seems fair that you get somehow paid for that. And of course, then there's the editing, and we all know how much time we spend in front of the computer. As a photographer, it takes a long time. And, the band doesn't see that. If you're doing a band, if you're doing a band shoot, the band turns up, or the talent turns up, and they're there for like an hour or however long it takes for the shoot. And then they go home and then they wait for the images. What they don't know is the hours that you've put in beforehand and the hours that you're putting in afterwards. And really, all they see is an hour of your time. Why should they pay you a few hundred quid or something, dollars or wherever you live, whatever your currency of choice is? What they don't see is all the other stuff that goes into creating this image. And so, you sometimes get this kind of attitudes like, oh, why is it so expensive? Well, because that's what goes into it, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so there are just a few reasons why I think that even if you're doing photography as a hobby, when you're doing work for other people, it's only fair that you get paid in some way, shape, or form. Whether that's money or whether that's in another way, that's something we'll address in a minute. But anyway, I think I've established that I think it's probably a good idea to get paid. Right. So let's move on from that. The next question is really, how much should I charge? Well, that's akin to asking how long is a piece of string, because I have no idea, zero idea. I don't know. Should you charge $10, or should you charge $100, or should you charge $1,000? Well, let's find out. Now, the first thing you get to think about is really, what's your market? And I know it sounds very marketing or whatever, but if you let's say for instance, let's say you want to do some headshots, on the side. Incidentally, that's kind of how I started my little headshot business. The first thing you can do is actually just look around and see what the competition is doing, and most likely you find a vast range. So in my area, for example, I'm very close to London. It really ranges from, there's a dude who charges £60 for headshots. And then, not far away from where I am, there's somebody else who charges £400 for a headshot. And then not much further, like right over there in town, there's somebody else who might charge £1,000 for a headshot. And so they all have their reasons for why they charge what they charge. And the best thing I think for you to do is to just establish where you sit within that market. What do the others, the competition, what do they have that you don't have? Or what is it that you can bring to the table? And where does your work sit? And this is really quite important. Where does your work sit within all of that? Do you think, the guy who charges £60, is your work similar to that? Or do you think it's better than that? Is it more in the, if you compare yourself to somebody who charges £200 for a headshot, is it more like that? Or is it more like in the £400 range, or wherever it may be? But it's a good idea to really just get an idea, and then, to see where, and be really quite cool with that. I mean, we got to be, it's difficult to be objective, of course, when it's your own work, but, we've got to kind of step back and really look at, some images and go like, oh man, that's, that is lit really well. And it's actually, that looks better than mine, or like, well, actually I think I could do a better job than that. We just have to be fairly realistic, and throw all the arrogance and and all that out of the window, and just kind of really literally see where we fit in. And that gives us sort of a ballpark. That's not by far not all of it, and I think that works really well, especially if you're doing photography as a side hustle or side hassle. As a side hustle, then that form of charging is a good way to start. I mean, at least that gets you into a ballpark. There are many other factors that come into it when it comes to establishing, your fee structures and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's probably a good sort of a good ballpark figure, just so you know that you're not undercharging, and also you're not totally overcharging, ripping people off, because that'll go around very quickly, Okay, so then the next question is, how much am I worth? I sort of addressed that in the last bit. How much am I worth? Well, you're probably worth more than you think. I think especially with people starting out in the beginning, a lot of the times people sort of undervalue themselves. They kind of go, oh, well, I'm not sure. I've never charged anything, any money for what I do, and I'm not really that confident. And wherever I look on Instagram or wherever, online, I see other photographers and other work that's so much better than mine, and I'm just not worthy. All right. And so the first thing I'll tell you there is just forget about that. I just throw that out the window, because that's BS. You're definitely worthy, and it's really important. It's really important to understand that, as a photographer. It's important not to undersell the quality of your work. Again, you can kind of benchmark that in the ways that I described a second ago, but just be like, be realistic about it, and and kind of go like, well, yeah, I can, that's the bracket that I can fit in, and of course, I mean, I mentioned some definitive numbers. Remember that every market is different, and you just have to look around. Near where you live. Do you live in a big city? Do you live on the outskirts of a big city like I do? Or do you live out in the prairie somewhere? It's numbers are going to be different. The market in the US is going to be different from the market in Canada. It's going to be different from the market over here in the UK. It's going to be different from, your market wherever you are. Actually, in fact, that's always an interesting thing to know, is let me know where you are, because again, it's always super interesting to hear from people who are listening to the show, and we're always interested in knowing where you're from, and where you are when you listen to the show. So make sure you send us a message on Instagram or leave a little comment or something like that. That would be awesome. Anyway, so don't undersell your work. Now that's really important. First of all, it's important for you because I think it's important for your confidence and for your self-esteem, and but it's also really important for the industry as a whole, because the minute we start to undersell our own work, we're really dragging everybody else down to the bottom with us. It's so undercutting other people is not a clever business strategy. Once you undercut others, it's just a race to the bottom, just generally, and nobody wants that. So in a sense, the other thing is, if you undercut and if you go in right at the bottom, it's really, really difficult to get out of that hole. It's very difficult to establish yourself in a higher price bracket if you're starting right down there. I would always say, be realistic about the quality of your work and kind of place yourself somewhere in the middle. When I first set up my first photography business, and I had to think about where my price points may be potentially. I had to look at maybe 10, 12 different photographers in my wider area. And I just plotted it out on a chart, and I basically worked out, okay, well, this is where the average is. And I had to look at what kind of services they're offering, because that's very different as well. Some people charge a straight up all-in fee, and other people have like a pricing menu where you can put your product together. There might be a fee for the shoot itself, a session fee, and there might be, other things that you can add on, like additional photographs or whatever. People in the wedding industry know all about that. So you can kind of compare. Sometimes it's, you're not really comparing apples with apples, but you kind of, you know what I'm saying. You're going to get there, and then you're going to get an idea as to where you would sit. And just be confident about the fact that if you're thinking about charging for your photography, I think you're most likely going to be good enough, unless you're completely deluded. But you're probably going to be at a level where, you can totally charge for for your work. So, that's the barrier very often, I think, psychologically, is when people just can't get over the "is my work good enough" bit. As soon as other people tell you that your photographs are really nice, or you're really, really good photographer, you should probably take a little bit of that in, and use that to build up your confidence. Now, I've already mentioned earlier that photography is expensive. Now, when you put your pricing together, it's super, super, super important to really take a really hard look at what I call the right way of accounting. Now, what I mean by that is there are a lot of things that go into making a photograph that you might not necessarily be aware of, really, right off the bat. And unfortunately, all of these things cost money. So, it starts with, at the very, very start of it, it starts with, your gear. Your gear is expensive. The maintenance of your gear is expensive. Repairs and all that kind of stuff are expensive. It's not only the initial investment, but it's also actually maintaining your gear over time. And that's true for everything, like from the lenses to the camera bodies to the bag that you use. You might have, you might be lucky and get a job where you have to travel. So all of a sudden, is your little camera bag, is that going to cut it on a plane, or do you need something, bigger that's also immediately going to be a lot more expensive? So as photographers, we spend money on all sorts of crap. Pardon my French. Especially bags. I love a bag. I love a good bag. Yeah, good bag. I love bags. Here I said it. I'm into bags. Anyway, and in saying that, again, it's really not actually that vital that you spend a lot of money on the most expensive kit. Like when I first started my headshot business, I literally started with some speed lights, really cheap Yongnuo speed lights, and a fold up, pop up softbox that probably cost me 20 quid. Like, what is that, $30, something like that. That thing, I've shot that to death, and I used that for probably about 4 years or something like that, and it was absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. I thought, really, the pictures came out good. The clients liked it. I got work. I paid for it. Or it paid for itself many times over, of course, because it was so cheap. And so there was really no reason to buy anything, more expensive. As time went on, then of course you change the type of light you use for a variety of reasons, and your modifiers change, and you might want to sort of increase the type of products that you can offer. Maybe you want to experiment with different lighting, different ways of lighting, your subjects or whatever, and you need different modifiers. Or you have a job where, all of a sudden you have to, as part of it, you have to photograph a group, and then, your little pop-up softbox isn't going to cut it anymore, but you might have to invest into some umbrellas or some additional speed lights or whatever. So, as you grow, or as your business grows, there will be situations where you'll have to look at the gear you have and then add to it, whether you buy it or hire it. Different thing. So apart from the gear, though, the next thing is really marketing. I mean, if you want to attract clients, you're going to have to put something into it. They're not really just going to come your way. It's one of the biggest mistakes I think that people make. Actually, no matter what business you start, whether it's photography or if you're a guitar teacher or whatever, most likely people are not just gonna walk into your door. You're gonna have to do something to attract new clients, because you have to get the word out. You have to somehow get people to know and understand that this is what you do. So that's marketing, and there are many ways that you can market. You can, of course, market via social media, or you might have a website, costs money. You got to register your domain name, and then you've got to have a host for your website, and maybe although you can use services like Squarespace and something like that. This video is not sponsored by Squarespace, unlike just about any other video on this channel. Oh, not on this channel. Sorry, not on this channel. On YouTube in general, but it could be. That costs money. So if you're using a service like Squarespace, for example, that costs money. And if you have somebody else design a website for you, it also costs money. It costs a lot more money. So that's expensive. You might want to, run ads on Facebook. That costs money. And generally, if you want to use social media as a marketing tool, you need to produce content. That'll cost you money over time. So that's an important aspect. So that's money you're putting in on the front end before you've even attracted a client, before you've even done a single shoot. You've already spent a ton of money just on marketing your services, so you're gonna have to make that back somehow. And then that's like I said earlier, the pre-production phase. The pre-production phase is where you do all the planning, the location scouting, and all the rest of it, the time spent with the client, on the phone or emails or all the rest of it. All of that goes into that. And then, of course, the whole planning for it, you have to plan a shoot like that. You have to think about, what kind of gear do I need? Do I have everything I need? Do I need to borrow some stuff, or do I need to hire things in? Hire fees, expensive, again, cost money. Do I need to travel somewhere? Do I need to pay location fees? Location fees is something that I think a lot of people, especially, at the beginning of their career, tend to completely forget about. Very often you have to pay location fees to actually use a location to shoot. There are travel costs. So you got to get there by car. Petrol prices have gone through the roof. So that's a cost. Like I said, hire fees if you need to hire equipment. Whether that's lights or additional lenses or whatever it may be. You may have to get somebody else involved, because it might be the kind of shoot where you need an assistant. Assistants need to be paid. It's easy to kind of to drag friends in and stuff to stand in sometimes. In the long term, that's really not going to work, because, if you don't, ultimately, if you don't pay people, people tend not to be very reliable over time. And, when you work with a client, you need to really be reliable. So, So fees for assistance is really something to consider. There's also, things like insurances. Like in the UK, for example, as a photographer, you need to have public liability insurance. That's an on cost. Equipment insurance, very important thing. Highly recommend you have that, but that costs money too. And then of course, the tax man. The tax man needs to take, or feels the need to take, a lot of your hard-earned cash. And of course, depending on where you live, those percentages may differ. But, you can probably say, well, 20%, 25%, or probably if you live in the UK, more like 30% or whatever, that's going straight to the tax man. So you can kiss that goodbye. So really, if you were thinking about charging £100, you should really probably be charging £130 just to cover that bit. Man. So all of these things, marketing, pre-production costs, the shoot itself, that's your time, travel, on costs, actually, if you do a shoot at home, for example, we think like, well, I'm shooting at home, I have a little headshot studio and I can do it at home. So there's no on cost. You're wrong. There's tons of on cost. The electricity you use, heating, the rent you pay for your place, all of the utility bills, all of that kind of stuff, all of these things are actually costs to your business in a sense, and you need to account for that. So all of that needs to go into your calculation when you're thinking, well, first of all, should I charge for that or not? And you go like, well, I definitely should. I think by this point you probably agree with me. If you don't agree, if you disagree with me, then again, leave a comment, and get in touch, because yeah, it's a great discussion to have. I'm just telling you what I think. In my opinion, this is obviously, opinions different. That's all cool. That's what makes life worth living. Anyway, once you've sort of established that you want to charge for it, and you've kind of sort of getting, you get a ballpark idea as to where your pricing is probably going to sit, then the next thing to really work out is, what's your pricing model going to be? Like, is it going to be an all-in fee? Or is it going to be more of a pricing menu where you can put things together? Or are you calculating your prices in a different way? One way to calculate your pricing could be, for instance, that you think, okay, so how much do I need to live? So you can basically just do an annual kind of calculation. So per year, what's my rent, or what's my mortgage? What are my, on costs as far as my house concerned, all the utilities and all the rest of it, what's my car going to cost me, what do I need in food, blah, blah. So how much do I need to earn to live the way I want to live? And of course, that's different for everyone. That's different for you. It's different for me. It's different for Nick. It's going to be different for everyone, because it really very much depends on where you live, how expensive it is where you live, and, what your expectations are as well. Do you order pizza every night? That's going to hit your wallet at some point. Or, do you eat rice or something cheap? I don't know. Whatever your grocery bill comes to. Do you have kids? Do you not have kids? All of that, plays into it. Do you have other responsibilities? Like, for instance, are you married? Or do you live on your own? All of these things come into it, and so therefore, these things are different for everyone. So you got to just look at your own situation and kind of figure out, okay, I need this much. I need to make this much to to survive, or to live, basically, not necessarily to survive, but to live, the way I want to live. Then you got to think like, okay, well, how many weeks a year do I want to work? How much holiday do I want? Like, if you're in North America and you listen to this, you're probably going to be rather jealous. But over here in Europe, we do have very good, employment laws when it comes to holidays. So really, people here are used to an absolute minimum of 20 days of holidays, vacation days a year. And usually that's more like 25, up to 30 days. So it's I know. If you listen to this show and you're in Canada or in the United States, I know it's not quite like that. But you just have to think like, okay, how much do I actually want to work? Let's say, out of the 52 weeks in the year, you want to work for 48 of that, and you want to take 4 weeks off to go on holiday or whatever. Okay, well, that's now 48 weeks. You can take the amount of money that you need to live on. You need to add tax to that, and you also need to add a certain percentage that you want to reinvest into your business, because remember, there's a cost to running a business. Like I mentioned earlier, things like running a website, keeping the lights on, all that kind of, maintaining your gear, insurances, all that kind of stuff. All of that costs money. So there's a cost to running a business. You can work out like, how much does it cost to run your business? How much do I need to live? What's my tax burden going to be? And how much money do I want to have on the side? That's the profit part that I want to reinvest, into my business, sort of a thing. Well, and how much profit do I want to make? That's basically that. So you throw all these figures together and you come up with one lump sum, and then you basically say, okay, well, I want to work 48 weeks a year, and then you can divide that by 48, and you can basically work out how much money you're gonna make per week, and then you can work out how much money you have to make every day, and then you look at that figure and you're gonna faint. First of all, and you're gonna go, well, I'm never gonna make that much money. That's a lot more than I thought I would have to make. And then basically from that point onwards, you really have a benchmark, so you can really say, okay, well, that's the pressure if I want to do this. This is how much I have to earn, and then that's going to inform you. So if for instance, if you work out that you need to make £500 a day to to survive and pay your taxes and all that kind of stuff, then you're probably going to say no to somebody who asks you to do a photo shoot for 80 quid. That's going to take you a day and a half. It's really that easy, So that's one way of looking at it. Now, I mean, and then of course, when it comes to your specific type of photography, there are always multiple pricing models. And again, that really depends on what it is that you do, and how how you run your business. I'll give you an example from the world of headshot photography, because I know about that. And we've mentioned this multiple times on the show already. So, but it's just for as a matter of completion, sort of a thing. There's a number of different pricing models. You could use the sort of traditional package model, where you have different packages. A cheap package, a middle package, and an expensive package. And the thing is that most people are usually going to go for the middle package. The cheap one is going to be so cheap, it's going to have nothing to it. It's just going to be, I don't know, like say a 20-minute headshot session. Somebody comes in, bang, or 10 minutes or whatever you want to do. It's going to be, one headshot and out the door. It takes no time and it's relatively cheap. The most, the third package, the most expensive one, is probably going to be all bells and whistles. It's going to have way more stuff in there that anybody wants or needs, and it's going to be super expensive. And the middle one is going to be really where most people say, like, oh, that's pretty much what I need. It seems to be good value, sort of a thing. So, psychologically also, people tend to not want to come across as cheap by buying the cheapest package. And they also don't want to think, oh, well, I don't want to spend too much money, so I'm probably going to go for the one in the middle. So you'll find that, in my experience, I could probably say that probably 85% or something, maybe even more than that, of clients, traditionally have gone for the middle package. So really, the whole pricing structure is actually based around the middle package. So if I know that I need to make, let's say, for argument's sake, £400 a day, and I can book one client a day, if that's what I'm trying to do, then I know I'm going to have to charge them £400. Simple as that, right? That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to basically charge a session fee. So you could charge a session fee and say, this is how much the session is. And then you can sell additional photographs on top of that. So you can basically say, this is how much the session is, and this is how much I charge per photo. And, you can make the session unlimited in time. So if you're thinking, well, I'm going to book one client a day, well, you've got a whole day. I mean, and you think like, well, what if somebody takes up 6 hours of your time and then only buys one photo? Sure, that's going to happen. But you're also going to have the guy who, takes up an hour and a half of your time and then buys 10 photos. In actual fact, I did a session not too long ago that probably lasted about an hour and a half, and the guy bought 20 photos. Boom. So, there you really just have to think, well, over time, what's going to make me better off? And in my experience, when I changed my own personal pricing structure to that structure, charging a session fee plus photos, it's meant that I'm actually, I'm making more, I'm generating more income on every client or on every session that I book. That's absolutely definitely the case. So it does actually work, from my own personal experience. So anyway, you could also only charge per photo. I've heard that before. That could happen. So there's lots of different ways that you could charge. It's worth looking around and see what other people do. But it's also then important to take a step back and then just, make sure that you find a way that works for you. It could be a combination of, a type of package that includes X, Y, and Z, and you can add on different things. Like, you have a pricing menu, and they could, let's say a package comes with 3 shots, and then they can buy other ones on top of that. I've always found that it's sort of, I don't know, mentally it limits people. So if you have, if you say like, well, this package includes 3 shots, people immediately think, oh, I've got to pick 3 shots. And then when they hit that, and it's like, that's it. I think if you leave it open, then it lends itself more to people thinking, oh yeah, well, these are good. I get this and I get this, and and it's worth spending another X amount of pounds for another photograph. If you keep the time unrestricted, it also means that if your client has a good experience, and bear in mind that especially when it comes to headshots or portraits, when people first come through the door, they're always going to be nervous. So it's really down to you as a photographer to really get them to chill out and relax, and and you've got to make their experience a positive one. And once they're experiencing a positive experience, then, well, they might want to stick around. Then you have a chance to change out different backdrops, to change the lighting a little bit and create a range of different shots. And more often than not, if you create 5 looks, more often than not, people will buy at least 1 shot from each look. That's my own experience. And so, the better you are at coming up with different looks and changing things around to give your customer a variety of things to look at, the higher your chances of making more money on that particular session. Anyway, so these are all things you got to think about anyway. Now, we could talk about this absolutely forever. I've absolutely no idea how long I've already talked about this. Longer than I thought I would. But anyway, that's only one more thing. And that's really when not to charge. Because remember at the beginning I said, do we really have to charge all the time, every time we take our camera out of a bag? Well, of course we don't. Clearly we don't. I mean, there are many occasions where, I'd say I wouldn't charge. Now, I'll give you a few examples. One thing, for example, is charity. If you're doing a charitable thing, you wouldn't necessarily need to charge for that at all. If you're doing something, for a charitable cause that's close to your heart, that you really believe in and you really want to help, then it's absolutely fine not to charge for it. Of course you don't. You wouldn't. The way I look at that is that I like to be in the driving seat when it comes to those sort of shoots, meaning that I want to be the one who makes a decision as to whether I want to charge for that or not, or actually whether I want to get involved in something or not. So what that means, I can sort of regulate that throughout the year, because I can say like, okay, well, I've already done 3 charity shoots this year. I don't really want to do any more. Or if something comes along and go like, wow, this is a great cause. I really want to be part of that. Absolutely, Or it's just something, there might be situations or occasions where you just want to help. I recently, had a couple of friends, they're married and they started up in business, and they really, their business was, it's a startup business. They really don't have any money. They're really good people. I've known them for a long time, and they're really struggling with a free photo shoot that they had from by another photographer, and they're very unhappy. And I looked at the images, and I thought, I could improve on them, and so I thought I just wanted to extend my gratitude for their friendship. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to actually get them in for a session. I didn't charge them because I knew they didn't have the money, and that was just something I wanted to do. But that was a decision that I made. It wasn't like a thing of like, hey, I've got a party. Make sure you bring your camera. Or nope. Anyway, don't invite me to your parties and expect me to bring a camera. Well, do invite me to your parties, and I might bring a camera. I don't know, but anyhow. Okay, so another thing would be like test shoots, right? Test shoots are a really good example for things where you wouldn't charge any money, I mean, you might even invest some of your money into test shoots, because you might have to get other people in or props or hire things or whatever. But test shoots are really important because that's how we learn, that's how we improve ourselves, and that's how we move forward and get better over time. It's a really, really, really important thing. We do it as musicians all the time. When we practice songs that we don't necessarily play on stage, we just like playing them, or we like learning them, or we like learning the guitar solo out of a song. There's no initial benefit in it to us other than the fact that it might make us a better guitar player. So in photography, it's the same thing. Test shoots are super important. In fact, I'll link to an episode with it where we interviewed Joel Grimes, and he told us that for the last 40 years or something, he's been doing a test shoot every week. And so, it's no surprise that he's as good as he is. And, he's so good at lighting and posing and, and everything else, because he's just been learning for most of his life, for the best part of his life, and that's really what it takes. So test shoots are a really good example for, an occasion where you wouldn't necessarily charge, where you wouldn't really. And the other thing is collaborations. Sometimes it's just fun to work with somebody else. Maybe it's a great opportunity. Or again, you can enhance your own skill by working with somebody else. So collaborating with other people is super important. And again, it's something you wouldn't charge for. Another thing that comes up a lot is TFP. So TFP is time for prints. So it's a very common kind of bartering arrangement whereby you give your time, or somebody gives their time for prints. So for instance, in the olden days when we were still doing prints, who's still doing prints? If you are doing prints, then hit us up, because we're thinking about doing an episode on printing. So time for prints. So basically, you would get together with a model, and the model would basically give their time for prints. So you would you do the shoot. The model would offer his or her services for free, and in return they would get prints of the photographs. So they come out with something because they can build their portfolio, and you come out with something because you've just had a great model to shoot. So everybody's in it to win it, essentially. So collaborations, TFPs, super important thing. I mentioned bartering. Bartering is often forgotten. That's also a form of payment. When we think of getting paid, I think we often think in terms of money, but actually bartering is a great way to exchange services. Maybe there's somebody who has something that you need or that you want, and by organizing or arranging a photo shoot with them, you can barter for a particular service. It could be something. Anybody who's got kids knows all about bartering. This is like, bringing up kids. It's all about, I think, you're in this negotiation bartering situation every day, right? So you wash the car for me, and therefore I take you to the cinema. Great, it's an exchange of services. That sort of thing. Or I give you a lift to the prom if you, do the dishwasher and clean out the rabbits. Standard in my house. Anyway, so bartering is a great thing. It could be anything from, getting your car washed, or if you're working with somebody else, maybe they have a skill that is useful to you, and could help you out with something, and therefore in return you could do, you could do them a favor and do some photos. When you evaluate barter, though, I think what is important is to actually think in terms of like, how much is my service actually worth, and then think, okay, well, there's got to be a certain degree of equivalence. I think that's important, and then of course, as always, portfolio shoots and personal projects. I mean, clearly you wouldn't charge for that. Portfolio shoots do help you to build up your portfolio, and the return would be that people would look at your website and your portfolio and go like, oh, that's really cool. that seems really good value for the money he's charging or she's charging, and you can basically improve your own situation that way. So portfolio shoots are really important, and it is important to improve your portfolio continuously, and we're all guilty of letting that rest for probably too long. But you should definitely always work on your portfolio. And so if you don't have a regular string of clients coming in yet, then you can offer that out to many people, friends, relatives, whatever, and build up your first portfolio that way. Or you might think, I want to do something very specific as a portfolio shoot. Maybe I can find something to do for TFP or some barter or something like that. And then, of course, personal projects. Well, personal projects, you can call them test shoots. We talked about that a second ago. But personal projects are just things that are dear to your heart and you really want to do. And then, obviously, you wouldn't necessarily charge for that either. So there are many different reasons as to why you wouldn't charge. But back to the basic question that we started this whole thing with: should hobby photographers charge for their skill of their services? Well, in general, yes. But there are many occasions where I probably wouldn't. Anyway, so let me know what you thought. I'd really be interested in hearing your thoughts about this. Are you a professional photographer and you already have very definitive thoughts on this, or are you somebody starting out and you sort of thought about maybe trying to earn some money from photography and you're just not sure how to do it yet? Or are you, maybe an amateur photographer and you're doing, you've started charging for some stuff? Or are you somebody who's doing photography as a side hustle? Let me know. It'd be really super interesting to hear from you. You get in touch. You can get in touch on Instagram, on Facebook. Join our Facebook group, by the way. Or, send us a pigeon. Anyway, that is it. That's all we've got for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Or watching, if you're still doing that. And hopefully from next week, we'll be back in the room together. So that's it. Episode 110 in the can. See you next Thursday.